Hi everybody, I'm Neil Wilson. Some of you may recognize me. I've been associated with CSI Meeting for more than 20 years now. I'm a retired congenital and structural interventionist, and I've learned a great deal from coming to this meeting from friends and colleagues. But I'd like to tell you something about the Challenging Cases session, which we run very early on Saturday mornings. You may think that's not a good time to run it, 7 a.m. after a big social dinner, but it's remarkably popular. And I think it's popular because we generally learn from each other's mistakes. And you could argue much better to learn from somebody else's mistake than your own mistake. But I'd like to tell you about a case I presented some 10 years ago now, and I learned a lot. And that case involved a 17-year-old young man who'd been born with a complicated congenital abnormality of pulmonary atresia associated with a ventricular septal defect and these additional multifocal aortopulmonary collaterals. He did extremely well following an operation in San Francisco at the age of 4 months, where he had a right ventricular to pulmonary artery conduit and repair of branch pulmonary artery narrowings and closure of VSD. That served him very well until he was about 8 years old, and he required replacement of his right ventricular outflow tract with a homograft. I think it was 16 millimeters diameter. But some 9 years after that, I guess, when he was 17, he represented with severe right ventricular outflow tract obstruction within the homograft. He, if I remember correctly, had suprasystemic right ventricular pressures, something like mid-90s, compared with an aortic pressure of 80. The conduit, as is often the case, the homograft, as is often the case, was extremely calcified. His regurgitant fraction really wasn't very bad at all, only mild, but we felt the best option at the multidisciplinary team meeting was that we should attempt to put in a percutaneous valve, a Melody as it happens, that was the only one available at that time, for this young teenage boy. And so we went on. We were always concerned about the calcium because this is a risk for fracture. And I started off deciding that I would pre-stent his outflow tract using a 20 millimeter stent, a Palmas stent deployed to 20 millimeters using a high pressure balloon. That went really quite well. We noticed though that on the angiogram there was a small leak outside this calcification. But importantly, this young man's blood pressure and heart rate were unchanged. Blood pressure in the mid-80s, heart rate around 90. It was always our intention, because of the severe calcification, to add some strength to our stenting by putting in a second stent. So we put in another Palmas stent, again to 20 millimeters. It looked really very good. Until some minutes after that, his heart rate quickened to something 110, 120, and his blood pressure fell into the mid-70s. There was no severe collapse of his cardiac output. But we realized what was going on, that he was still bleeding. He had ST segment elevation, and my immediate thought was, oh, he must have a coronary compression, although we had done a coronary challenge test before proceeding with the stenting. But actually an angiogram showed that his coronaries were completely normal. There was no interruption of his coronaries at all, and I really couldn't work out why we were having such ST segment elevation. Until, of course, we did an echocardiogram when it was clear he was developing tamponade, and that his ECG changes weren't ischemic, they were pericardial. So we're in a bit of trouble now. His hemodynamic situation is deteriorating. We needed to stop the bleeding. So I did two things. One, I wanted a covered stent of some sort. Now, covered stents 10, 11 years ago in the United States of America were not available. End of. Not available. But we did, of course, have the Melody valve, which in a way is a covered stent, albeit with the valve in. So we implanted a covered stent, we implanted the Melody valve to 20 millimeters, hoping that the leakage outside of the fractured outflow tract would improve. But it didn't. Then I did something which I now know retrospectively was wrong. We were draining the pericardial effusion and auto-transfusing, and that was working well. His blood pressure was hanging around the 80 millimeters of mercury mark. But I decided we should reverse his heparinization. So he had protamine to reverse his heparinization. By the time we got the second stent in, the second valve in, it was clear his hemodynamics were deteriorating. His blood pressure was falling into the 70s. And of course, those of you now will know that all we did by giving him heparin was, instead of having a liquid pericardial effusion, we now had a pericardium full of clotted blood, which was not allowing the heart to fill. So we're in serious trouble. And this is where we decided to call the surgeons. And thanks to the whole team of surgeons, and of course the anesthesiologist and the cath lab team in Colorado, the child went to the operating room and had a replacement of his conduit. And thankfully, thanks to them, all went well. So what did I learn, really? Well, I learned thereon that several things. First of all, I could have performed that whole procedure knowing it was at high risk of fracture of the prosthesis in what we call the hybrid cardiac catheter lab, where the lab is all set up for an immediate cardiac surgical procedure. And I didn't do that. Why didn't I do it? Stupid? I don't know. The second thing, why would I do a procedure? Well, of course, I had to then, but nowadays I learned you'd always take on covered stent, either as a primary pre-stent or certainly having a covered stent in your armamentarium should you end up with a fracture. And the third thing, of course, don't reverse the heparin. So I hope those mistakes that I made really helped the other guys in the challenging cases. And of course, the other thing we discovered, and that was in the operating room, that the fracture was large. It was 2.5 to 3 centimeters long and encroaching right from the main pulmonary artery aspect into the cavity of the right ventricular outflow tract. I think everybody who saw that presentation has learned something. I certainly did, thinking about things again. And I hope that if you come to the Challenging Cases session tomorrow, you'll learn something new. And as you've often, or some of you have heard me say, a bad experience often leads to a good decision. Or is it a bad experience leads you to good decisions in the future? Thanks for listening.